Good morning, it's Thursday the 2nd of November here in London. This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, Gaza's border crossing opens for the first time since the war started, with hundreds of foreign nationals allowed to leave.
In other news, applause for a pause. Markets cheer as the Federal Reserve leaves its benchmark interest rate unchanged.
Plus, our exclusive interview with the CEO of Barclays, CS Venkatakrishnan, tells us job cuts are coming, but the bank's Asian operations will be largely spared.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
The US President Joe Biden says Israel and Hamas militants ought to pause fighting as foreign passport holders start to exit the Gaza Strip. A further 600 foreigners are expected to leave via the Rafah border crossing into Egypt today. But despite protesters interrupting his comments at a speech in Minnesota, the US President stopped short of supporting a full ceasefire.
The United States is going to continue to drive humanitarian support for innocent people in Gaza who need help, and they do need help. We're going to continue to affirm that Israel has the right to responsibility to defend its citizens from terror, and it needs to do so in a manner that is consistent with international and humanitarian law.
Biden also hailed the international efforts to open the Rafah border crossing. The Qatar-mediated deal allowed the departures, including of American, French and British citizens, which required agreement from Hamas, Egypt and Israel.
Now, in other news, the Federal Reserve has left its benchmark interest rate unchanged. Its decision to keep its base rate at 5.25% to 5.5% was unanimous. Chair Jerome Powell hinted that the central bank may now be finished with the most aggressive tightening cycle in 4 decades.
We're going meeting by meeting. We're asking ourselves whether we've achieved a stance of policy that is sufficiently restrictive to bring inflation down to 2% over time. That's the question we're asking. We're looking at the full range of economic data, including financial conditions and all of those things that we look at. And then we've come very far with this rate hiking cycle, very far.
Powell's dovish pivot cheered markets, with the S&P 500 index closing more than 1% higher on the day. The target range of 5.25% to 5.5% is the highest interest rate since 2001.
Meanwhile, the Bank of England is expected to keep interest rates unchanged for a second consecutive meeting later on today. Traders will be looking for any hint of future monetary policy easing when the bank updates its forecasts. Governor Andrew Bailey has so far pushed back against any speculation around rate cuts, saying the discussion is premature while inflation remains well above the BOE's 2% target. Bloomberg Economics says today's decision may not be unanimous, but that the Monetary Policy Committee will probably warn tightening will recommence if inflation risks persist.
Barclays CEO CS Venkatakrishnan says that planned job cuts will largely avoid its Asia division. The UK retail banking giant had a disappointing third quarter where it failed to match US peers. The boss of the London-based lender says that layoffs, though, are coming.
It is a reduction in workforce, generally speaking. In Asia, we, of course, have very booming economies, and we also have a very growing business. So proportionately, it's far less likely to impact this region.
Venkatakrishnan telling Bloomberg about his strategic review in an exclusive interview there. It's not only Barclays, though, feeling the pinch. Financial services job postings in the square mile dropped by almost a third in the quarter to the end of September compared to 2022.
The former CEO of crypto exchange FTX, Sam Bankman-Fried's fraud trial is nearing a verdict. Bloomberg's Sonali Basak says prosecutors used Bankman-Fried's own words against him in their closing arguments to the jury.
So what they are now saying is you saw him come in early to his own defense, very clear-worded, very clear-headed. And a day later, you saw him walk into the prosecution, stumbling over many definitions, stumbling over many things that the prosecution put right in front of him, books, articles, as to what he had said, and then watching him either not remember or deny what has been written or said about him.
Bankman-Fried's defence team has insisted the FTX co-founder has made mistakes but did not commit crimes. They argue he's been unfairly cast as a villain and a monster. The jury is looking to begin deliberations in the trial later today.
Transport services across the UK, France and the Netherlands are facing disruption due to high winds and heavy rain from Storm Ciarán. The severe weather warnings are in place for much of southern England and Wales, with a red alert for the Channel Islands. Andrea Ayres is an operations manager at the UK's Environment Agency.
We know this is going to bring us exceptional weather. We've already got 6 flood warnings out around Devon and Cornwall coast, and we know that we are looking at probably 2 weeks of rain in 24 hours.
That heavy rain that Ayres is referring to has prompted rail companies, including GWR, South Western Railway and South Eastern, to urge people not to travel.
Let's turn back to events in the Middle East. The US President has called for a pause in fighting between Israel and Hamas in order to free hostages from the Gaza Strip. As Israel's campaign against Hamas has resulted in thousands of deaths in Gaza, President Biden is coming under growing pressure and criticism. Joining us now with the latest is Paul Wallace, who leads our coverage of economics and government in the Middle East. Paul, great to have you with us. Is the US President having influence over Israel on this matter? What could a pause in fighting represent rather than necessarily a ceasefire?
It does seem like the US is having influence with its private discussions with Israel. So in public, it is very much embracing Israel's strategy and giving it space to carry out its plan to destroy Hamas as it describes it. But in private, it is calling for restraint. It is emphasizing again and again to Israel the need to protect civilians as much as possible. It seems like the U.S. managed to get Israel to delay the ground offensive on Gaza for quite a bit of time, probably 10 days or more, chiefly to try and get hostage negotiations to progress. What Biden said last night was very interesting. He's obviously not the first person to call for a pause, what a lot of people are saying should be a humanitarian pause in fighting, but the fact he said that suggests that there is a good chance Israel will be forced into that position. Israel has very much ruled out a ceasefire, and that's a pretty negative word in Israel right now, but it is possible that it agrees to some kind of pause, which is likely to be short-term, may only last for a few hours, but something that's designed to allow more aid into Gaza and allow more people out of the enclave.
Yeah, what is the situation currently in Gaza? The World Health Organization says that there have been 3 attacks affecting health facilities in 24 hours. The situation on the ground is, as you understand it, Paul?
The situation is still dire, and if anything, it's getting worse. A little bit more aid has been going into Gaza through the border crossing with Egypt in the last few days. It's hard to get precise numbers, but we think it's somewhere between 50 and 100 trucks a day, and these trucks are carrying things like medicine and food. But that's still way down from before the war. Gaza was getting about 500 trucks a day of food and medicinal supplies and other things. There's still no fuel going into the territory, which is a big problem. And that's something that Israel is very reluctant to allow, because it believes that fuel will get into the hands of Hamas, and it will be used for Hamas's military operations. Obviously, we had some foreigners leave yesterday. Again, it's hard to know the precise number, but it seemed like it was a few hundred, 300, 400, maybe 500 people leave. All of them seem to have been foreigners, although there were some injured Palestinians as well, and more expected to leave today. And we think that quite a few Americans will be allowed to leave today as well. So at least for foreigners, at least the situation is looking better, in the sense they do look like they now have an exit route through Egypt.
Meanwhile, Paul, there's been more exchange of fire on Israel's borders with Lebanon and Syria. How much concern is there now about the overspill and how this conflict could spread across the region?
That's still a big concern for Israel, for the US, frankly, for the whole region, that this war properly spills over onto Israel's northern borders with Lebanon and perhaps Syria. Since Israel went into Gaza with ground troops. The situation on the northern border with Lebanon hasn't really picked up that much. We're seeing sort of daily skirmishes between the Israeli Defense Forces and Hezbollah militants, but it seems to be contained at the moment. We are watching for a speech on tomorrow by Hassan Nasrallah, who's the head of Hezbollah. So he is doing something. He is speaking tomorrow. That's fairly rare for him. It will be the first time he's spoken since the Israel-Hamas war began on October 7th. So people are going to watch that very closely. There's no indication yet that he's going to call for Hezbollah to start a war with Israel or anything like that. But it is possible that he ups the ante and indicates that Hezbollah is going to step up its operations against Israel, which would be a big development. So we'll be watching that pretty closely tomorrow.
OK, Paul, thank you so much for your reporting and your insights. Paul Wallace there, who leads our coverage of economics and government in the Middle East.
Now, should we hike more? The words of Fed Chair Jerome Powell hinting at peak rates on Wednesday after the central bank's decision to pause. Powell also noted the financial conditions have tightened significantly in recent months, a dovish pivot that cheered markets. Joining us now to discuss is Bloomberg Television anchor Kriti Gupta. Kriti, good morning to you. How much did Jerome Powell leave the door open then for a future rate hike, something we've been watching for very closely?
Well, it depends on who you ask. If you ask anyone in the markets, no room at all. They think it's a complete U-turn. But if you were to ask Chairman Powell, I'm sure he would say, look, the door is still open to rate hikes. In fact, he said no real thoughts have been made around the December meeting. It wasn't even discussed. It was only about what was happening in the here and now. But again, the markets really interpreted it as this idea that because he didn't double down on the hawkishness, therefore it's a dovish pivot. And this is, of course, the market's getting ahead of itself a little bit, but you can already see it in some of the bets where if you look at what the December bets actually are, they've completely pared back, suggesting that maybe the Fed might hold for a third straight month.
Does the US really, though, manage this no recession soft landing outcome?
They might. It kind of looks like it's working out for them. I think to even the Federal Reserve surprised that the U.S. economy is able to navigate it because, look, they had recession forecasts going in to the fall of last year. And that was something that the markets had priced in as well. So this resilience, this in the housing market, in the jobs market is kind of a surprise to everybody. But I think what's important is what Chairman Powell actually said about the recession call, which he's saying we think we can actually navigate it. Now, to be fair, he is paid to say that. He is paid to say that, look, we can navigate it very well, as is the Treasury. I think the bigger kind of takeaway that he did issue concern about was we don't actually know how the geopolitics are going to shake out. He did mention that. He mentioned the UAW strikes. He mentioned the oil prices as well. He said that even though you are seeing resilience, things can deteriorate very quickly because the risks are still elevated and it all kinds of happens in a little bit of a vacuum. He also said that the market pricing is doing a little bit of the work for the Fed itself. And I think that is probably the takeaway that everyone should have from that press conference.
Because there was a lot of focus on the idea of how this dramatic rise in Treasury yields have done some of the work of the Fed for them. So that's providing a bit of relief for Jerome Powell as well. The Bloomberg Instant MLive poll survey after the Fed decision showed majority of respondents seeing yields on 10-year Treasuries, though, climbing past 5%. So it looks like this might not be over.
Well, that was his entire point, though. He said, yes, it's doing a lot of the work right now. The question is it sustained? Because you can also see yields go in the opposite direction, which we are seeing this morning as well. And I would argue that if you can make the argument that yields to the upside are doing a lot of the work for the Fed in terms of rate hikes, do yields to the downside serve as some sort of rate cut for the Federal Reserve? Now, that's, of course, a lot of extended thinking. And Chairman Powell, if I'd asked him that question, would say it depends on how long those yields are lower for it to really make an impact. Whereas we have seen the sustained selling that's leading to the momentum and ripple effects in the mortgage market.
OK, Kriti, thank you so much for being with us.
Now let's bring you one of our top interviews. The Barclays chief executive says he plans to spare the Asian business and the bulk of job cuts as the British bank embarks on a reduction in its global workforce. CS Venkatakrishnan has been speaking to Bloomberg at the bank's annual Asia Forum in Singapore, where he addressed the issue of cost cutting while speaking to our colleague Haslinda Aman.
So the bank, since 2019, with COVID, with everything else, has not really looked at its own efficiency. And our workforce has grown in many areas. And what we are trying to, and at the same time, we grew it for a lot of projects and investments. Many of those projects are coming to an end. And obviously, we will look to redeploy staff in other areas. But there will be some areas where we can become more efficient, and that's what we will do.
Such as?
Well, I think it cuts across different activities which we do. And I think if you look at the cost-income ratios of our various divisions, they are slightly higher than the competition, and we should get to a level which is more akin to the competition.
Does cutting structural costs mean a reduction in your workforce, whether it's globally, whether it is in Asia? And I'm just wondering what the impact would be in this part of the world.
So it is a reduction in workforce, generally speaking. In Asia, we, of course, have very booming economies, and we also have a very growing business. So proportionately, it's far less likely to impact this region.
Is there a way of quantifying, first, the numbers, and two, where might the cuts be done? Would it be perhaps your investment banking, front office? Is there a sense you can provide?
So there is a way of quantifying, of course, but I'd rather keep that discussion to February. In terms of businesses, it is not so much business specific as trying to look at all of our businesses and get them to a productivity and an efficiency that we think benchmarks well to our competition. And so there will be more or less in different areas and different businesses.
You're optimistic about Asia. Where are the growth markets? Where are the growth areas?
So I think you have to take a very, very, very long view in these things.
And by that, what, 20 years?
At least 20 to 30 years. Barclays started in Singapore 50 years ago, as you mentioned. We started with 9 people and a £90,000 annual budget. Okay, now the numbers are, of course, much, much larger. But it was the vision of those people then to invest with a dollar bond trading desk and clearing. In the same way, we have investments in India where we have a full-fledged capability in investment in corporate banking and wealth. We've got, of course, a large trading center here in Singapore. We've got it in Hong Kong and in Tokyo. I think Asia, generally speaking, is growing at a much faster rate than the West. The US is going through a bit of a growth spurt right now, but certainly more than Europe and the UK are. Banking should generally grow at the rate of GDP over the long period. So that means for us, it's important to be in Asia where there is growth. We are a wholesale bank here largely. We do some private banking, which means it is for us the ability to connect with corporate clients and institutions in Asia and to help them in turn connect with the capital markets in London and New York.
Asia, of course, diverse. We talk about Asia growing, but when you take a look at a key market like China, it's actually slowing down from what it is used to, 8% now, possibly 4% or even less. How are you looking at China and the potential, especially for your wealth management business?
Yeah. So we are largely an institutional business. And I think in wealth, it would be a little ambitious for us to try to think of China right now. We should do better in the UK. But in China itself, look, there are many countries in the world which would take 4%. And China has accumulated a lot of capital, a lot of skill. And, yes, there are excesses in parts of the Chinese economy in real estate. But their technological prowess is really strong. The entire clean energy economy cannot exist without Chinese components and Chinese raw materials. And even Chinese finished goods, like cars, are beginning to occupy a greater and greater space. So you cannot ignore China. You have to think about China and helping Chinese companies connect to the world. India, of course, is growing very well, and so are other parts of this region. But it'll be what we do is concentrated in the major trading centers and the major economies.
And we're hearing that Japan has been the strongest market for you. Give us a sense of what you're seeing and the plans in Japan in particular.
Yeah. So we've been in Japan also for a very long time.
But it's suddenly alive.
Yeah, well, it took 30 years. So you have to be patient sometimes. But Japan is seeing a reflation. I mean, interest rates, the stock market, Japanese companies, Japanese banks. We are a very large participant in the Tokyo Stock Exchange. And one of the things that we have invested in Asia consistently over many years is what we call our prime business, allowing people to trade equities, borrow against equities, and we provide low latency connections to all the major exchanges in Asia. It's one of our specialties. And so we do that in Tokyo and in Hong Kong, and we'll continue to invest in that.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.